You know, some days are just days, but others, they completely change the course of history. Today we're talking about one of those, a single, brutal 12-hour period that transformed a nation, redefined a war, and haunted one man for the rest of his life. So let's get right into it, the Battle of Antietam.
First, I just want you to look at this number, 22,727. Just let that sink in for a second. What on earth could that number possibly represent?
That, right there, is the combined number of casualties from both sides in just 12 hours of fighting. It's what makes Antietam the single bloodiest day in all of American history. I mean, more Americans were killed, wounded, or went missing on this one day than in the War of 1812, Pearl Harbor, and 9/11 combined.
So the big question is, right, how did this unbelievable carnage, all packed into one single terrible day, completely alter the path of the Civil War? And really, the future of the United States? That's what we're here to figure out.
Now, to really get a feel for this battle, you have to understand what was going on at the time. We're in September of 1862, and for the Union, it was a time of deep despair. After a whole string of demoralizing losses, the Confederacy had gotten bold enough to invade the North for the very first time, marching right into Maryland. Panic was definitely setting in.
For the Confederacy, this invasion was about so much more than just winning a battle. For General Robert E. Lee, a victory on Union soil was a political masterstroke waiting to happen. He was hoping to sway the upcoming midterm elections, maybe convince Maryland to join the Confederacy, and, this is the big one, get official recognition and help from Britain and France. But President Lincoln had a secret plan, a gambit of his own, basically tucked away in his desk, the Emancipation Proclamation. He knew it would completely redefine the war, but he just couldn't issue it after another loss.
And this quote, wow. This tells you everything you need to know about the pressure Lincoln was under. His own Secretary of State, William Seward, told him point blank that issuing the proclamation from a position of weakness would just look desperate. It wouldn't come across as his bold moral statement, but more like the dying gasp of a failed government. Lincoln needed a victory, and he needed it now.
Which brings us to the day itself. September 17th, 1862, near a tiny little town called Sharpsburg, Maryland. Here, along the quiet banks of Antietam Creek, two massive armies collided in what would become a day of almost unimaginable violence.
Now, the Union general, George McClellan, had almost double the number of soldiers. It should have been a decisive win, right? Well, his plan was executed poorly. Instead of one big overwhelming punch, the battle just sort of stumbled along in three separate, desperate fights. The morning was this horrific back and forth in a simple cornfield. Midday, it all centered on a sunken farm road. And the afternoon was a bloody struggle for a single stone bridge. This piecemeal attack let the outnumbered Lee shift his troops around to meet each new crisis, turning a potential Union victory into just a brutal, bloody stalemate.
To really understand the sheer chaos of it all, we're going to follow one guy, Lieutenant John Gould of the 10th Maine. He was in the very first wave of the attack at 5:30 in the morning. In just a few minutes, a quarter of his entire regiment was either killed or wounded. His simple, chilling memory of it says it all. It was very easy to die that day.
By midday, the absolute heart of the battle had shifted to the Confederate center, which was this sunken road that basically acted like a natural trench. The fighting there was so concentrated, so intense, the bodies were piled so high that an officer later said you could have walked 100 yards just on the dead without ever touching the ground. The place would forever be known as Bloody Lane.
At sunset, the fighting finally stopped. On paper, it was a tactical draw, but the consequences, well, they were anything but. In the quiet aftermath of all that carnage, the entire nature of the American Civil War was about to change. Forever.
So here's how it all played out, step by step. First, Lee's battered army had no choice but to retreat back into Virginia. The invasion was officially over. This gave the North just enough room to claim it as a strategic victory. And that was the opening Lincoln had been waiting for. Just 5 days later, he issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And just like that, the war had a new, higher purpose. It wasn't just a political fight to hold a country together anymore. It was now a moral crusade to end slavery.
And this had massive ripple effects across the globe. By reframing the war as a fight against slavery, Lincoln made it politically impossible for countries like Britain and France, who had already abolished slavery, to step in and help the Confederacy. With one document,
Lee's greatest hope for foreign support was gone.
But Antietam didn't just transform the politics of the war. It fundamentally and brutally changed how the public saw war itself.
Get this. Just 2 days after the battle, a photographer named Alexander Gardner shows up, and for the very first time in American history, a battlefield was photographed before all the bodies could be buried, before the wreckage was cleared away. Up until then, most people's idea of war came from these heroic, romanticized paintings. Gardner's photos, they showed the unvarnished, gruesome truth.
When these images were put on display in New York, they caused an absolute sensation. The public was floored. They were in shock. This quote really captures that feeling of sudden, horrifying realization. The romantic myth of war pretty much died at Antietam, replaced by the brutal truth captured on these glass plate negatives.
The battle itself may have ended in a day, but for the guys who actually survived it, the echoes lasted a lifetime. Which brings us back to Lieutenant John Gould.
So, the war ends and Gould goes back home to his quiet life as a bank teller in Maine. But he could never, ever escape what he saw at Antietam. For the next 67 years, he was consumed by it. He spent his life writing letters to other veterans on both sides, just trying to piece together the chaos of that one day, trying to make some kind of sense of the senseless.
He never stopped trying to solve the little mysteries of the battle. Who shot at his men from that tree line? Where exactly did his friends fall? As he wrote late in his life, the unanswered questions still kept him awake at night. For him, the war ended, but the battle never really did.
To truly wrap our heads around the scale of the slaughter, let's put it into some modern context. Now, this chart shows just the number of Americans killed. We're not even counting the wounded or missing. The roughly 3,650 Americans killed at Antietam in one day is more than the deaths at Pearl Harbor and more than the deaths on September 11th. It was, and it remains, a day of almost incomprehensible loss.
So that one day changed the purpose of a war. It changed our perception of war, and it consumed men like John Gould for the rest of their lives. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If that single bloody day never truly left him, has it ever truly left the nation it helped to redefine?